Welcome to English with Miss B. This is the second video in our series on Hamlet. Today we are going to unpack the rich history, the incredibly tense politics, and the profound philosophy that forged Shakespeare's absolute masterpiece. I mean, imagine taking one of the world's oldest revenge stories, throwing in some ghosts, intense corruption, massive family betrayal, and deep philosophical questions to create what a lot of critics still consider literally the greatest play ever written.
But here's something that kind of surprises a lot of readers. Shakespeare actually didn't invent the plot for this play. Not at all. If we truly want to understand this incredible story and, score top marks while we're at it, we first need to wrap our heads around the volatile world that actually inspired it. Because well before anyone ever utters those famous words, to be or not to be, there is a whole universe of context we've got to explore.
So, to get a complete grasp on all of this, we're going to travel back in time through 5 key areas today: Shakespeare and the legend, the Elizabethan worldview, humanism, reinventing the revenge tragedy, and finally, the story right before the play begins. We absolutely have to cover these bases before we even step foot on the haunted battlements of Elsinore.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Shakespeare and the legend, transforming an ancient myth. And we'll start with the man himself, William Shakespeare, who was, as you'll see, way more than just a talented writer.
So born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, he was an actor, a super-savvy businessman, and a shareholder in a massively successful London theater company. Between roughly 1590 and 1613, he churned out about 39 plays. We're talking everything from hilarious comedies to grand histories. But what's really fascinating is that he's remembered most for his masterful tragedies, right? Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and of course, Hamlet. But like I mentioned a second ago, he didn't invent the basic plot of Hamlet. That story had actually been floating around for hundreds of years before he was even born.
What Shakespeare did was take that existing plot and just totally pull off a radical shift. He started with this 12th century legend of a Danish prince named Hamlet, written by a guy named Saxo Grammaticus. In that original ancient story, an uncle murders the king and marries the queen, and the hero is just supremely confident. His main driving question is purely action-oriented. How do I kill my uncle? He never second-guesses the act of revenge itself. But Shakespeare keeps the murder, the marriage, and the madness, and completely flips the core psychology. In his 17th century version, the hero is anxious. He's unsure. Instead of asking how to get revenge, Hamlet asks, wait, should I? And that one single change, it literally transforms a basic action legend into literature's greatest psychological drama.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Elizabethan worldview, anxiety and the cosmic order. We're going to leave Denmark for just a second and travel over to England around the year 1600. The crucial thing to understand here is the intense anxiety that was bubbling just beneath the surface of Queen Elizabeth I's society. Sure, England was booming with trade and the arts, but there was this massive, unspoken fear. Elizabeth was aging. She'd never married, and she had no children, no clear heir. And citizens remembered the civil wars of the past. They were deeply terrified of a disastrous conflict breaking out when she died. So, to Shakespeare's audience, watching a fictional Denmark with a suddenly dead king, a really shady new ruler on the throne, and rumors of war everywhere, that didn't feel like some distant fairy tale. It was a terrifyingly direct mirror of London's own deepest political fears. And this cultural anxiety was massively amplified by how they actually viewed the universe. They deeply believed in something called the Great Chain of Being. Basically, this was the absolute belief that God organized the universe into this rigid, perfect hierarchy. Every person, animal, and object had a very specific, designated place, from God at the top, down to the king, the nobles, the commoners, all the way down to nature. The golden rule was that if this strict order was ever disturbed, total, utter chaos would inevitably follow.
So, how does this tie into the play? Well, when Claudius murders God's chosen king, who happens to be his own brother, he doesn't just commit a regular earthly crime. He literally shatters the fundamental architecture of the universe. It's a cosmic crime. The fallout of attacking the natural order is just catastrophic. Chaos follows, ghosts appear, war threatens, families completely collapse, friends betray each other, and nature itself gets deeply disturbed. Claudius basically renders everything in Denmark completely out of joint.
On top of that, this rigid hierarchy came with incredibly strict social and gender expectations, which essentially traps our central figures. Elizabethan men were expected to be brave, strong, and instantly decisive. That totally explains the conflict around Hamlet.
He gets actively mocked for grieving openly instead of acting like the ideal stoic man of the time. And then look at the women. Ophelia is constantly controlled and micromanaged by the men in her life. Queen Gertrude, on the other hand, is heavily criticized for her rapid remarriage, which brought up some really difficult questions about feminine power and identity back then. These rigid rules literally box every single character into impossible corners.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Humanism and Holy Fears. The Renaissance mind meets immortal stakes. We absolutely have to factor in the massive intellectual shift that was happening in the background of all this.
So, the Renaissance was this vibrant period of rebirth where scholars were rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman writings. This gave rise to humanism, which was a philosophical movement that prioritized human capability for reason, deep curiosity, independent thought, and the active investigation of ideas. It was a total rejection of just blindly accepting tradition. And think about it, nobody represents this revolutionary shift better than Hamlet. When he's faced with a crisis, he outright refuses to just blindly follow the traditional violent path. He actively chooses to investigate, analyze, and reason it out for himself.
Notice the classic Renaissance figure on this slide, representing that deep curiosity and capability for reason. Unlike your standard action heroes who just instantly rush into violence, Hamlet represents the ultimate humanist. But, and here's the tragic irony, his immense intelligence is the exact thing that prevents him from blindly acting. He analyzes every single angle so deeply that it leads to profound overthinking and ultimately total paralysis.
But we have to remember, it wasn't just abstract philosophy holding him back. It was literally a fear for his immortal soul. Let's look at the religious stakes here. In 17th century England, religion was a volatile, literal life-or-death issue. Catholics believed that purgatory existed and that ghosts could be mortal souls seeking peace, which means, hey, you should trust the ghost. But Protestants heavily rejected purgatory and believed ghosts were highly likely to be deceiving demons, which means you must fear the ghost. So just imagine being Hamlet for a second. A ghost appears, looks exactly like your dead father, and demands you commit murder. His hesitation isn't just simple indecision or cowardice. It's a completely rational attempt to figure out if the devil is tricking him. I mean, he's risking his immortal soul here.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Reinventing the Revenge Tragedy, Subverting Audience Expectations. Let's look at the actual theatrical genre and what those Elizabethan audiences were paying their hard-earned money to see. Basically, when they went to the theater, they wanted an action-packed blockbuster. If a hero's family was murdered, the audience expected immediate, violent payback. The standard recipe for an Elizabethan revenge tragedy was crystal clear. You absolutely needed murder, you needed ghosts, pretended madness, spies sneaking around, deep political corruption, and a whole lot of violent deaths. And Shakespeare, well, he checks every single one of these boxes. He gives the audience all of those ingredients they crave. But then, he completely disrupts the formula. Instead of just asking the standard blockbuster question, will Hamlet get revenge, he fundamentally subverts audience expectations by asking a much more profound question. Is revenge actually the right thing to do? With that one massive pivot, he totally transformed the genre. He gave his bloodthirsty audience a brilliant philosopher instead of a simple action hero.
Which brings us to the core insight of everything we've covered so far, the true anatomy of hesitation. You've got humanist overthinking pulling him one way, that absolute need to analyze and investigate. You have the Protestant fear of demonic damnation pulling him another way entirely. And you have the chaotic fallout of a shattered great chain of being, a disrupted cosmic order weighing down on him from above. Hamlet's famous delay? It is absolutely not a plot hole, and it's not a sign of simple cowardice. It is the highly rational response of a brilliantly intelligent man being completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of his era's conflicting philosophical, religious, and political rules.
Which brings us perfectly to our final act today, Section 5, The Story Before the Play, The Powder Keg of Denmark. Now that we deeply understand the incredible philosophical and political pressures of Shakespeare's world, let's hit rewind and see exactly what happened right before Act 1 begins.
So a bitter, years-long geopolitical feud sets the stage. Years ago, King Hamlet of Denmark defeated King Fortinbras of Norway in a single battle, and according to their agreement, Denmark inherited a chunk of Norwegian land. Eventually, both of those kings died. King Hamlet died very unexpectedly, and his brother Claudius immediately snatched up the throne and quickly married the widowed Queen Gertrude. But the conflict didn't die with those kings.
Tonight, right now, the dead Norwegian king's son, young Fortinbras, wants his father's land back and is secretly gathering an army. So as the play opens, we have a highly vulnerable Denmark rapidly and desperately preparing for an imminent war, all while dealing with a sudden, highly suspicious royal succession.
And while the rest of the royal court seems perfectly ready to just move on and celebrate their new king, Prince Hamlet is totally disconnected. This massive rift has opened up. He remains deeply isolated. He is still actively mourning his father. He is wildly uncomfortable with his mother's super hasty remarriage to his uncle, and his brilliant intuition is screaming at him that something is terribly, terribly wrong.
And then the absolute impossible catalyst happens. Denmark is on the brink of war, the royal family is fractured, the universe feels completely out of joint, and late at night, out on the freezing castle battlements, deeply frightened guards see something impossible. A mysterious, silent figure appears, and it's wearing the exact armor of the dead King Hamlet. It says nothing. It simply appears and disappears. Terrified and totally unsure of what to believe, like, is it a soul in purgatory or a demon in disguise, they decide to call upon Hamlet's highly trusted, scholarly friend Horatio to investigate. And that is precisely where Shakespeare opens the play. He doesn't open with a powerful king on a throne, or an angry prince, or some massive battlefield clash. He opens in the freezing dark, with a frightened guard asking one simple question: who's there? So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder before our next explainer. How does this single, terrified question in the dark completely ignite the greatest psychological drama ever written? Thanks for diving into this with me today, and keep questioning everything.